Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por asistir. Hoy tenemos la plática de la doctora Braban del Reino Unido, del Centro por Ecología e Hidrología. La doctora Braban se graduó en el 94 con honores en metalurgia y en ciencias de materiales en la Universidad de Oxford. Hizo su maestría en la Universidad de Aberdeen en química analítica y el doctorado en la Universidad de Toronto en Canadá. Se graduó en el 2004 del doctorado. Trabajó hizo una posición postdoctoral en el NERC, que es el National Ecology Research Council. Y desde del 2004 al 2008 desde el 2008 tiene una posición en el Centro por Ecología e Hidrología del National Council, NERC, es National Research Council for Ecology. Entonces, sus temas lo que hace actualmente es líder del grupo de cambio en la composición de la atmósfera en el área de ciencias de los efectos y química atmosférica, ahí en el Centro por Ecología e Hidrología. Sus temas de interés son la calidad del aire urbana y rural, con énfasis en el amoníaco y en especies reactivas de nitrógeno. Le interesa en particular las observaciones de largo plazo y experimentos con instrumentos de alta tecnología y también métodos de bajo costo. Le interesan las mediciones, la modelación y el estudio de los procesos para cuantificar procesos que impactan en la calidad del aire y en el cambio climático. Sus temas actuales en los que está trabajando son el desarrollo y el mantenimiento de herramientas para estimar impactos de fuentes puntuales de gases traza, el desarrollo y el deployment, la instalación, la implementación de instrumentación y de muestreos para la medición de gases traza y de aerosoles. También tiene trabajo reciente en el impacto de plumas de volcán en el Reino Unido, con mediciones en superficie y el planear las respuestas a esas plumas, y también en la transferencia de conocimiento y experiencia en instrumentos de bajo costo y con sistemas de aseguramiento de calidad, del monitoreo de especies de traza, en particular pues, el amoníaco y el nitrógeno reactivo. Bien, entonces le cedo la palabra a la doctora Braban. Sorry.
No worries. Muchas gracias. Hablo un poquito español, pero hablo en inglés ahora. So thank you very much for inviting me today. My talk's titled Impacts of a Changing Chemical Climate in the 21st Century, and in particular the role of ammonia and other reactive nitrogen pollutants. The talk brings together parts of a lot of the research projects which we undertake at CH, the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. As you may have guessed, I'm an atmospheric scientist, not an ecologist or a hydrologist, but many of my colleagues are. So I'm currently the group leader of the Atmospheric Composition Change Group, and these are some of my colleagues, and we vary from working with the high-resolution instrumentation, so Marceli Twig, Matt Jones, John Kenterspear, through to the data informatics roles. David Lever is our lead on that, and Sim Tang leads on our low-cost sensors. And our science lead is Professor Mark Sutton, who has developed a lot of the techniques and the science underpinning our understanding of ammonia in the environment. So what is the clean air that we're aiming for in atmospheric sciences? Do we want to go back to pre-industrial times, or can we go back to pre-industrial times? Or are we looking for something which is what might be termed an equable atmosphere that isn't the same air everywhere? I think it is good enough air quality everywhere would be the air equality. And we need to do that with the sustainable population and with waste emissions minimized. And in theory, that should give us some sort of equable atmosphere. How do we get there? Well, we need to understand where we are with the atmosphere. So what is the state of the environment? And then identify the impacts of the things that we think are causing the problems. Are we measuring the correct chemicals and with the correct metrics to understand them? How is the state of the atmosphere changing from gas phase to particulate mass composition? Are we measuring all the correct species? And then finally, how can we mitigate that? What improvements can we do there? And that underpins science and policy with consistent approaches. So this is a very busy slide. There's very many versions of this, and I've made sure the numbers are nice and small so that you can just focus on the wider picture. So in the mid-20th century, we learned how to pull atmospheric nitrogen, molecular dinitrogen, into reactive forms and use it, in particular to make synthetic fertilizers, which allowed us to improve soils to make them more agriculturally productive. And similarly, we were releasing NOx from industrial processes, from the hydrocarbons which were locked in. And that nitrogen goes into the terrestrial and oceanic ecosystems and moves around, so you can have natural processes, unintended processes, and intended processes within that. And the losses and the leakiness of that system is what causes a lot of the pollution that we struggle with today. In past change, so this shows the future risks of global fertilizer use. This is looking back from 1962, 2006 and up to 2050 for the different continental regions. As you can see, for every region, the fertilizer use is predicted to go up in the next 30 years. In some regions, enormously, and in other regions, to a lesser extent. So South Asia, Latin America, I expect it to increase a lot. East Asia, development countries, less, but overall for the globe there is perhaps a 50% increase in predicted. Whether that's correct or not. How does that feed into our future climate predictions? How does climate have a role in that? So once you put your agricultural fertilizers with ammonia into the world, does atmospheric ammonia go up? Under the several of the different scenarios in the climate predictions, which I won't go into because I'm not an expert in them, ammonia is mostly predicted to increase in emissions relative to 2008. So many scenarios have a 50% increase. The most optimistic scenario has it staying about the same as we are now, so no net decrease in the future. Where do these emissions come from? Going through the sectors, agriculture, this is in teragrams of nitrogen per year. So agriculture is the major source of 33 teragrams of nitrogen per year. And then you have residential, industry, transport, energy, biomass burning. And the ocean is thought to be a small emission source as well. The budget of that ammonia, where does it go once it's emitted into the atmosphere? I'm using some slides from Claudia Stedman. She's just finishing her PhD and has done a sort of global modelling study of where does your ammonia, which is emitted, go. And these are the atmospheric budgets. I know many people won't be able to see the numbers, but primarily The sinks of the ammonia are either deposition back down to land, either dry as a dry chemical depositing on the surface, or wet deposition being captured by rain and deposited on the surface. And then the main other mechanism for loss is aerosol formation, ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate, and potentially reactions with organics. And that occurs throughout the globe. This just summarizes our basic understanding. Ammonia, compared to, I'll show you some oxidized nitrogen in a second, is relatively simple in that your ammonia will be released and it will either redeposit or react to form something in the particulate phase or gas phase. And then the loss from the atmosphere is this deposition, either dry or wet. I'm just going to take a little segue across into the natural world to where else is there ammonia if we were going back to that pre-industrial world. So the wildlife colonies of the world are the major natural source of ammonia into the atmosphere. We had a PhD student, Stuart Riddick, who's now, I believe, in the US, studied the global population of seabirds, and these are where all the major colonies are. There's 480 million pairs of birds in the world, evidently, seabirds. And we looked at their emissions and where they go, and this can be analogous to what we do with ammonia and ammonia deposition from fertilizer. So the emission depends on the mass of the bird or the process, the amount of time they spend at home, and what they're nesting on and what the climate is. Now, the important thing about ammonia is that its emission rate is very strongly temperature dependent. So emission doubles for every 5 degrees increase in temperature. This is sort of shown here from an experiment we did in a cuvette, very small cuvette experiment, where we were simulating seabird nests. And for every 5 degree in temperature, you saw an approximate doubling of the ambient ammonia concentration, which is how you can understand those climate scenarios, is that even if we made our processes more efficient, actually if the temperature goes up, you're still putting more into the atmosphere. The other thing from this is the substrate on which you put in this case, guano. Birds definitely nest on rock, sand, soil, and turf. The amount of ammonia which goes back out into the atmosphere depends on that. So on the rocks, most of the ammonia comes back into the air, whereas with the turf and soil, you lose ammonium into the soils, and that goes into the aquatic system and the hydrological processes. So he did some modeling with the future scenarios, and the background ammonia due to the seabird population is due to increase in most places, not so much in the southern latitudes, and a limited amount in the northern latitudes, but in the mid-latitudes, this is about, so the red is about a 25 to 40% increase in the percentage volatilized of the ammonia, of the nitrogen as ammonia. So back to the atmospheric chemistry. We know that oxidized nitrogen is very complicated. You probably all in your classes and studies have seen the detailed cycling of NOx once it goes into the atmosphere, reacting across to nitric acid, nitrous acid. At CH, we're doing more work and more interested in what goes on at the surfaces. So this is doing the analogy for oxidized nitrogen. It's actually quite complicated as well. So when your chemical, so here nitrogen dioxide, nitrous acid, nitric acid deposits, there's many fates or sinks for those chemicals, which are dependent on surface processes. So what type of surface are we at? Rock, soil, vegetation, and then also the biological component of that. What bugs are there? How are they eating those nutrients, using those nutrients, recycling them into partly metabolized products and fully metabolized products. I just put in here as well some of the more complicated oxidized nitrogen, dinitrogen pentoxide, peroxyacetonnitrate, and chlorine nitrate. For ammonia, looking globally, the dominant sink, going back to Claudia's modelling study here, the dominant sink over the oceanic regions, which is the yellow, is conversion to ammonium sulfate. In the in the equatorial regions, it's wet deposition. And over much of the continental areas, it's conversion to ammonium nitrate in the atmosphere. The problem is that that's not quite the end of the story, because then ammonium nitrate itself is semi-volatile. So depending on the temperature, it will go back to ammonia and nitric acid. And these maps show you the fate of the dominant sink for your ammonium nitrate. The blue is wet deposited, so it's rained out. And that happens a lot in the northern regions. And all the red areas are where it converts back to ammonia and nitric acid. And there's some very small green areas where the dominant loss is by dry deposition. So this, so that's what's happening in the atmosphere, what's happening with the ammonia at the surface. So ammonia, as I said, when it deposits, it can dry deposit. And if it deposits on vegetation, there's a couple of different places it can go. It can just adsorb onto the surface, onto either the waxy leaf, and then either react there or re-emit, re-volatilize. Or if there's moisture around, it can convert across to ammonium, which is a nutrient, so the plants can use it. And once into that system, that ammonia, as ammonium, now influences soil, water, nitrogen, respiration, photosynthesis, decomposition, carbon sequestration. So the knock-on impacts of that nitrogen being put into the system cascade through the environment. One example of this we've been doing experimentally in Scotland since 2002 is synthetically mimicking a poultry farm. So we have the lovely field site next to, it's a big moorland, which is very wet, very cold, very windy. We have the best weather, and occasionally it's sunny. And we have this down here is what where we emit ammonia gas simulating a small poultry farm. And when the wind is in the right direction, it releases, as in the southwest segment, and the rest of the time it doesn't release. And there's a transect along here in which we measure the concentration of ammonia, and we look at the composition of the vegetation and the soil and the groundwater. We have, at the back edge here, we have wet deposition treatment plots where we deposit the ammonia equivalent ammonium as rain. So what we've seen over time, and I would say still 16 years out, damage is still increasing across the plots. Is that you see Calluna is one of the dominant grasses you see in low nitrogen ecosystems. And so this is on the x-axis is the distance away from the source. So this is low nitrogen and this is high nitrogen deposited. And you can see the percent of the original grass is highest when you're further away, and when you're close, you've almost completely destroyed your original vegetation. And what you see is that other species move in, invasively, competitively winning out because they like the nitrogen, they can use it and they can thrive. So you have a competition and a degradation effect. In Europe, under the Habitats Directive, which is one of the EU legislations, which I'd rather not talk about Brexit today, there's a requirement to protect habitats which are endangered, and in this case they're endangered from atmospheric pollution. This is I'm not expecting anybody to read the details on here. This is some work we did with Portugal, where they were trying to rank their habitats currently as to how much risk they are at from nitrogen pollution in changing that ecosystem. And you can see that there is a small fraction which are completely not likely to be impacted. There's some which are absolutely fine, but there's a significant proportion which are at risk. And a lot of the work, I think if we understand the impacts, which this work is doing, and then you're understanding where the impact is going to happen, you can start to introduce your preventative measures. So, we've identified the impact for this case in ecosystem damage and change. The metric, the measurement which has been developed across Europe and is used globally for understanding the impact, is the critical level. So the concentration of the pollutant, in this case ammonia. There's critical levels for ozone as well. And that's the metric by which we can work out whether a system is endangered. So then you have to get some evidence and measurements. Now, ammonia measurement is not as easy as it sounds, just because it's a sticky gas and it's at low concentrations, and it reacts to form particles readily in the atmosphere. So you need to try and measure it without interference from particulates, for instance, the ammonium sulfate, nitrate and chloride. You need to decide what timescale you need to know it at to understand your impact. So is it daily, hourly measurements you need, or is it an annual average? Is your method going to be sensitive enough to measure it? And can you measure it well enough to look at change in your system? And can you afford it? Is the, always for research. So ideally, for a lot of the impact assessment stuff work which policymakers and consultants do, is you need to know that your measured concentration is good enough and you understand your error bars so that you can compare against a model and its error bars. There is no such thing as a perfect measurement, and there's no such thing as a perfect model. So you need to be able to look at these type of plots. So this is a log scale, because ammonia does occur over 3 orders of magnitude concentration in the environment. And this is looking at some poultry studies. So for this, we were happy. The model measurement comparison was good. So the traditional method for measuring ammonia has been wet chemistry, because ammonia is quite water soluble. If you extract it from the air into the water and then use a method for ammonium analysis, you can do a reasonably good job on doing that. Bearing in mind you need to not sample your particles, if at all possible, to interfere. This is an example of a wet chemistry instrument called an ammonia. It's one of our more portable ones. It's about 20 kilograms. We've carted our couple. It was a company in the Netherlands, which made it. We've carted it all over the world. This instrument on the left here is its big brother, or sister actually, the Marga. So this is a much more advanced excuse me, type. It has a rotating annular denuder, so you have a coated cylinder which turns all the time. You have a laminar flow of air through, and the gas can diffuse to the edges and be captured. It also has, you can't see it at all there, but it's something called a steam jet aerosol collector, so it samples the particulates as well. And that has on board an ion chromatography system, so you can do the IC every hour on every sample, and you can get hourly data. The opposite end of the spectrum are these passive samplers. These are CH-developed alpha samplers, which you deploy for monthly or weekly passive sampling, and they're very low cost. This is not very low cost. We, as part of a European metrology project, were comparing a lot of the instrumentation available on the market. In 2016, we had a measurement intercomparison, and it didn't really rain, which was nice. And we had about 14 instruments come to Scotland to test. A lot of them use infrared spectroscopy, whether it's cavity ring down or direct FTIR, or a quantum cascade laser. So Picaro Los Gatos, Tiger Optics, and AP2E, which was one of the more prototype instruments taking part. Picaro and these sort of small rack-mounted instruments are sort of the, I would guess, available and not too expensive options. And then at the top end of the scale, you have the sort of the aerodyne quantum cascade laser type instruments, which are good enough to do fluxes with. So you can measure the ammonia at 10 hertz and look at whether your ammonia is being emitted or deposited at the point at which you're measuring it, which is probably one of the most useful research tools that there is out there. You will see on the market at the moment some of these ammonia low-cost sensors starting to come through. The range on the market are for 0 to 50 ppm, which is about 3 orders of magnitude too high for ambient measurements. I'm hoping for the day when they get them down to ambient temperatures, concentrations, but there's a lot of work to be done to get there, I believe. This just summarizes the intercomparison study we did. So we put all the instruments into a field just near us, where we have an arrangement with the farmers, and he will put fertilizer on if we want it. And so we fertilized at the vertical line here. So the different layers are, so that was the rain. It didn't, which was a surprise. These ones were instruments with individual inlets, so the ammonia, the quantum cascade laser, and the MAGA, the online IC instrument. We then had the DOASes, so the differential optical absorption spectrometers, which are open path instruments, and measure along a length, and then integrate that, knowing the length, into a concentration. And these were on a rack-mounted manifold in the middle there. Just zooming in a little bit to just after the fertilization, where we started to see the increase. And this illustrates a little bit the variation in concentration you can get. So normal background concentrations in Scotland are just under 1 ppb. I believe they're slightly higher here, possibly in the 30 to 40 region. When we fertilized, and I think it was 40 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, we saw a peak maybe 12, 14 hours after the original fertilization, and that kind of went with the humidity levels. After it was quite dry when it was fertilized, the boundary layer came in, there was a bit of a fog, moisturized everything, and then we got the volatilization. The instruments all followed reasonably well, and my colleague Marceli Twig is in the process of pulling all the details out of this. There's a lot of data from 16 instruments to understand, all in their different configurations. The absolute concentrations at the peak varied by a factor of 50 in the hourly averages, which, if you're doing an emission factor from those data or doing some compliance measurements, that's a problem. And even at the low concentrations, there is significant differences between some different instruments. So the intercomparability, the data use is quite important. So some of those differences were inlets and filters. A couple of instruments, we let people set them up as they would have normally used them, and some of them had quite long inlets. And what you have in an instrument inlet is a surface onto which particles can stick, gases can stick to water, and you have a interaction over time. So when it was cold, you would get deposition, and in the sun, when the sun rose and it warmed up, you would then get little early peaks on some of the instruments, which were nothing to do with the ambient air. They were totally due to the inlet process. And again, that's just looking at the temperature gradient. Just going to give you a couple of examples of where we've been using data instruments and analysis. So this is an anaerobic digester unit in the west of Scotland. This was a master's project by a guy called Michael Bell, and we put passive samplers in the blue spots around the unit, and then we did some high-resolution measurements at the edge and close on top of the site. Just that this is a typical scenario of where the problems you have with ammonia. So we were thinking this is an ammonia source, but oh look, there's a dairy farm here. There's a road, big set of roads down here, and there's some housing with all the associated activity there. So it's ammonia emissions are in the environment and highly spatially variable. So this is the modelling he did from it with AirMod. So you can clearly see the dairy farm up here. You can see there's not much happening with the houses, and you can see the anaerobic digestion unit with its sources, and you can see on top of it are measurements, and we're measuring slightly higher than the model predicted. When you do a pollution rose, so the colour is the concentration, the direction north, south, east, west, and the wind speed is how far you are out. So all the ammonia at the edge of the site was coming from the digestion unit, with some coming in from the farm at high wind speeds. When we looked at the high resolution, it was quite nice. Most of the time it was quite low concentrations, and then there was these massive spikes, which we had to check whether they were real to start with. And we were like, well, what's going on the site to give that picture? And I haven't got the slide where with the pictures in this talk, but there's 2 point sources, it turns out, on that site. There's a continuous source on a cooling pond, which wasn't covered, and they were opening the door 3 times a week when the lorry with the waste arrived and chucked it out and punged it into the storage unit. So that site could have completely cut off its ammonia signal by using a better method for putting the waste into its unit and covering that pond. And that's where I think the mitigation for future is important. This is a poultry emission study. We're measuring just downwind of a poultry shed, and you can see the concentrations is pretty high most of the time, even if the wind is in the wrong direction. That was the 4 periods we had, and you can tell the proof is when they emptied the shed, the ammonia went away. That was the end of that. Building up from a site, you then want to look at your landscape, and then from the landscape you build up to a regional and national picture. This is a landscape in southern Scotland, which has got lots of poultry houses. You can see them with the red splats of high concentrations. They're quite lucky here because our semi-natural area, which we'd want to protect from earlier, is on the west. So this is a protected area. There's no protected areas here, which is lucky for them. But you can understand the nitrogen balance in an environment then and start to build up where are they applying those manures, how could they improve those sheds to remove that ammonia from the environment. So we used our measurement data for a lot, from the campaign work, emission factors, emission mitigation, and deposition. Now just going to move on a bit to how we do the long-term monitoring. So campaigns are very good. For government evidence, we need to understand what's happening long-term. I think it's actually just about coming back in fashion. Since I've worked at CEH, long-term monitoring hasn't been fashionable for government, but it's starting to come back in. I coordinate, for my sins, one of the UK national networks called UKEEP, UK Eutrophying and Acidifying Atmospheric Pollutants Network, and it's the networks which are in the background environment, not in the urban areas, and not on the road network. We have the National Ammonia Monitoring Network, we have the Acid Gas and Aerosol, the Nitrogen Dioxide Background Network, so they have to be a kilometre away from a main road, and the Wet Deposition Precipitation Composition Network. And that's used for national purposes, and I'll have a slide on that in a second. For the ammonia network, we use a mixture of the passive samplers and active samplers. So this is a denuder system where you pull the air in through denuders in a filter pack, you measure the volume of air, and then you can calibrate them against each other. We have 72 sites currently, gone down from 85 last year, 2 years ago. So I've talked about the CH alpha sampler. There's many types of passive sampler out there. As long as you get the protocol right for them, they're all as good as each other, more or less. They have sample an effective volume of air. So the volume is dependent on the diffusivity of the gas, the diffusion path length, your absorbent filter, and the time of exposure. And then you can calculate your concentration. This is an example of one of the calibrations for the active versus the passives. For the 9 sites we have in the network where we have both technologies, and you can see it's reasonably, well, R squared is 99.99, so that's good. And you use this calibration to work out the uptake rate, that diffusive uptake rate, in an operational way rather than a theoretical way. And it works out within 5% of some chamber tests we recently did, which is reasonably good. You have to be careful of contamination. We are sources of ammonia. We have it on our breath. We use that to check an instrument is working sometimes. But when you're doing samplers and you're preparing them, you must take care not to breathe on them, not to touch them, because then you've completely, and when you're transporting them as well. This is an example of not doing it. If you have your inlet capped, this example was 0.36. If you didn't cap that inlet between sampling and bringing it back to the laboratory, your concentration had gone up by a factor of 5 or 6. If you only covered it with something which was semi-permeable, you still had contamination. This is the ammonia trends for the UK for the last 20 years nearly. And there's an awful lot of data in there. This basically means the concentration has not changed at all since the network has, on average, across the UK. And that emissions have gone down a tiny bit. They've actually gone back up again in the last 2 years. There's a paper by Sim Tang, if anybody's interested in looking at the details, that I can give you a copy. However, when the net was set up, it was used to try and look at sectors as well. So for the site, the 5 kilometre square around it, we looked at what was the main agricultural use of that land, what were the main emission sources of ammonia, so we could look in the long term as to what changes were happening. So this is a typical cycle here for ammonia. This is January to December, monthly average for the sites which are pig and poultry, cattle, sheep, and background. Background and sheep basically follow the temperature profile of the year. So they deposit and the ammonia emits depending on the temperature. Poultry, you have high continuous with some peaks when the spreading seasons are happening, when the manure is put out across the land. This is the ammonium in the particulate phase for the same period and annual cycle. So in the UK we have a very strong spreading season, fertilisation in spring, and ammonium nitrate is formed. Again, this is primarily in the pig and poultry areas, but in all areas we see the increase in ammonium nitrate. One of the things I've learned running a network is you have to use your data, and we make our data publicly available in several databases, and it is used for the mapping and modelling of pollutant concentrations deposition for the UK. It also feeds into national and international assessments and underpins planning processes in the UK. So we get a lot of usage and downstream use of the data, which isn't initially what you would think it would do. Jumping into urban areas for just 2 minutes. Urban ammonia is much less studied than rural. This is a study by a summer student we had in Edinburgh over this side, and this is some of the typical concentrations in the literature for ammonia. These ones are all relatively low. I've seen higher more recently. There are more urban studies coming through. In Edinburgh, we found the highest sites where there was dog walking, where there was a petting farm, so where the children can meet the animals, and where humans were making a mess. But also at traffic sites. So traffic is a known source. If your catalytic converter is not operating efficiently, one of the byproducts is ammonia. And there is growing evidence that ammonia isn't well characterized in the urban environment and what the predictions are for it in the future. Currently they think the emission factors may be out by 2. James and many other people in the world are starting to look at this in more detail, and hopefully in the future we may understand it better, and I think that's critical for understanding particulates in the urban environment. We have one passive sampler in urban UK currently in London, and this is from 99. It was going down in the early 2000s, and since the move from diesel to petrol has occurred in the last few years following the NOx emissions scandal and other drivers, we may be seeing an increase again, but again it's 1 point, so we need to know more. So to summarize, just as societies realize that climate implications of fossil fuel, I think the reactive nitrogen and the feeding the world, how we use our nutrients, is becoming as important to understand for a sustainable planet. How can we prove, and Mark Sutton is leading, there's a international nitrogen assessment project, which I believe Mexico is affiliated with. So there's a lot of work starting to happen on trying to understand and make things better. How to improve things, emit less. It sounds silly, but yes, try and emit less. And that's by process change, managing what we do better, maybe finding efficiencies, making fewer leaks in the system, recapturing emissions where the impact is local. And I'll just give a couple of examples of, so agroforestry, the use of trees around animal agriculture or arable agriculture crops, has had a bit of research studied. So we did some at CH where we looked at if you put a tree belt downwind of poultry emissions or slurry, and we found that you can actually, either by recapture of the trees or by dispersion, reduce the concentrations downwind of that site. And that is important if you are trying to protect a particular ecosystem. It's not an answer in the long run because you're then pushing your nitrogen into either the wood or the soil. You may affect your climate forces, so your N2O emissions for those soils and vegetations. But it does work. We've done some case studies, and this was with at a site where we could have a wooded and a non-wooded transect downwind of a poultry shed, and it was about varied between 10 and 25% recapture of the ammonia compared to the open transect. So in the rural peri-urban areas, I think the agricultural ecosystem interactions are key for understanding the nutrient management. And I think there is a tension to maintain the productivity, to feed everyone, while reducing those impacts. How to find the evidence, and I think developing criteria for representative sites and impact assessments is important, and then working across the communities to find the solutions. In the urban, again, the role of the exhaust emitted ammonia in particle formation is quite important, I think, to understand what changes in car technologies will have on the very local environment, and understanding what other activities contribute to that background. Biomass burning, waste management. And I think that depends very, very much on the locality of where you're trying to solve a problem, the climate, the culture, the travel modes. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias, Christine, por la plática. Aarón.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Just curious, the residence times of different compounds of ammonia and ammonium?
That's a key question. So the residence time at the surface of ammonia is very short. It can be seconds. Within a kilometre, you can be back down to background. Once you escape that the bottom of the boundary layer, then it very much is dependent on the climate and the other pollutants climates around. I think the major question arising from Claudia's global modelling is you have the pollutant hopping effect of ammonia. When it transitions into ammonium nitrate, that allows it to be transported further. It then gets re-emitted. So the net lifetime is something which should be quantified, I believe. But yes, I think it's going to be different globally, but the other part of it is that I haven't, and actually many researchers haven't, quantified the organic effect on the ammonium. So you will get ammonium oxalate, ammonium malonate, reactions with secondary organic aerosols. So what that impact on the net pathway as well is not well understood.
Thank you for your interesting talk. So I have a couple of questions, and the first one is, these particles coming from ammonia or ammonium, they seem to be important for human health. But in comparison to other particles such as soot or PAHs, is this something that we should be concerned? And the second question I have is there any study showing that these ammonia particles have any impact in cloud formation?
I'll answer your second question first. So when I did my PhD way back when, in 1999, the assumption was that all particles were were ammonium sulfate or sea salt. So ammonia has always been important, and ammonium for cloud formation, cloud processing, and that is true for ammonium whatever it's reacted with to form a particle. So the answer is yes, it is important. So the first question about the health, I am not a medical scientist. I believe there is a lot of work being done currently on which parts of particles cause the human health effects. So recent work looking at the early instance of dementia and the heart disease, clearly asthmatic, and COPD, the pulmonary disease, are all impacted by particulate matter. The specific effects of which components, I think, is still an ongoing research question, and untangling the particulate versus the gas phase chemical effects as well, because often they're all there together.
Thanks for your talk, very, very interesting.
Thank you.
In America, countries like Canada and USA have been working for many years in the development of critical loss, temporal and spatial variation of critical loss for sulfur, critical loss for nitrogen. And in the case of Europe, which is the status about the development of critical loads?
So critical loads and levels are part of the EU Air Quality Directive and Habitats Directive. So the methodology for measuring them and how they adjust the levels, it comes under, there's a working group to develop those. For the actual impact of nitrogen and nitrate deposition, there are a couple of different methodologies. So there's also, I'm going to forget the name, it's a cumulative impact metric. So there are several metrics which are developed and are developing. I think for legislative purposes, they're sticking with the ones they've got, so the critical load, critical level. But certainly across Europe, they are developing and looking at how to look at the long-term effects and the turnover as well. So yeah, it's I think like for ozone, there are a lot of metrics for ozone. There are fewer for nitrogen, but the evidence base for them is developing, I think. So I have colleagues who are much more specialized. So Ed Rowe in our Bangor site. Jane Hall, who just retired, but she led the critical levels working group for a while. So I can pass you on for discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question. I can see in your graphics that there are more ammonia emission during the summer in North Hemisphere. What is the reason about that?
So in the summer, in the Northern Hemisphere, it's the main agricultural growing season, and it's hotter. So the primary reason is that more is being put on the land, and so more will be volatilizing during the hot periods. So the contrast between the northern and southern hemisphere, I'm not an expert on that. However, the amount of emissions also varies quite strongly with the method of agriculture. So how intensive your agriculture is, and how you practice it. So not all low-resolution, low-tech agriculture is clean. Some of it can have a lot of emissions, and not all high-intensity agriculture emits a lot. But how it's implemented does affect it. So it's more complicated than just they're doing it. It's the local methods for applying agriculture.
I have one question. Is there if there's satellite instruments to observe ammonia?
Yes, yes. If you look at the papers by Clarisse et al., sorry, I didn't put. I often have a slide with the satellite coverage of ammonia. So yes, there is satellite coverage. It shows a fairly similar picture to the modelling with the high concentrations over Southeast Asia, up towards the Himalayas. The Po Valley is very clearly seen in Italy. The resolution is getting better. I believe some of the new satellites will have better capability. So yes, there is.
Hello.
Hi.
You mentioned that the emissions from vehicles depends highly on the quality, well, in the state of the catalyzer. Do you know of any study who has estimated the contribution in a city of how much the ambient concentration of ammonia is affected by the vehicular emissions?
There are a few studies come out relatively recently. I can try and send you the papers afterwards. I don't remember the names, but there was a study in Zurich where they were looking at tailpipe emissions around the city, which showed quite clearly that there was an ammonium source coming from the older vehicles, or not the old vehicles with the catalytic converters not working well. So yeah, I can pass on some references for that.
Thank you. Hi, Christine. There's a question regarding to the monitoring. You mentioned a little bit of low-cost monitoring. So, thinking about the new companies that want to send everything regarding to now monitoring ammonia, what is your recommendations in terms of this kind of new equipment, low cost and passive? Because the thing is, people can buy equipment and then start to make measurements and probably spread out a lot of information that probably is not in under the evaluations. Yes. What do you recommend in that sense?
So I'm in the last couple of years joined a couple of European working groups on standards, one for passive samplers and one for low-cost technologies. I would recommend before buying anything you borrow and put it next to some high-cost technology, high being high, such that you can understand how well it's working is the first thing, really. Ask to borrow it, ask to try it out, because there have been quite a lot of people stung in the last 5 to 10 years of buying new technologies which are touted to do really, really great things, and they don't. So I think it's a buyer beware, try it out, put something next to it first. And then also, I do this because I have to cost up the network, I have to cost up projects. With the low-cost technology, work out how much time you will need to clear up the data such that it's good enough to believe, which is, at the moment, certainly for some of the back of the envelope calculations I've done for nitrogen dioxide analyzers, it's much cheaper to put 100 diffusion tubes out there, or buy a 10,000 pounds, I have to translate it to Mexican dollars, but a 10,000, 9,000 pound molecularly specific high-cost instrument, which actually you just need to calibrate once a quarter and you believe the data and you don't need to do anything with it. The cost-benefit analysis at the moment says buy something more expensive, but at some point in the future that will cross over once. I think when the low-cost measurement has interferences and you have to correct for meteorology, other pollutants, wind speed, etc., there's always going to be inherent questions about how you correct that data, and will it capture unusual events, because there will be an algorithm which is doing that correction. So I think you have to have confidence in what you're going to do. This is a simple answer.
Ok, bueno, entonces ya si no hay más preguntas, muchas gracias.
No problem.
No problem.